Los Angeles, November 22nd, 1963. The sunlight that afternoon had been deceptively gentle, the kind that spilled lazily through tall windows and painted warm rectangles across the living room carpet. Dean Martin sat at the edge of his dining table, jacket draped over the chair behind him, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest a man who had finally allowed himself a quiet hour. A half-finished lunch cooled in front of him, steam thinning into nothing. The television murmured in the background, some harmless midday program, the kind no one truly watched, only listened to the way one listens to rain. Dean wasn't laughing, he wasn't singing, he wasn't even really eating. He was thinking about nothing in particular, which, for a man whose life had been noise and applause and spotlights, was rare and precious. Then the screen flickered. The program cut off mid-sentence. The music vanished. The image fractured into black and white confusion before reforming into the face of a news anchor who looked as if the world had just ended and he was the only one who knew. Dean's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Breaking news from Dallas, Texas. The words landed strangely, without weight at first, like dialogue from a badly timed movie. Shots have been fired at President John F. Kennedy's motorcade. Dean slowly lowered the fork. He leaned closer to the screen, as if proximity could clarify what his mind refused to process. The broadcast jumped to chaotic footage. A convertible, people running, a woman climbing onto the back of the car, hands over mouths, police sirens howling through the television's small speaker. The president has been taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Dean stood. He didn't remember pushing the chair back. He didn't remember his knee hitting the table. He only remembered the sound his heart began to make inside his chest, heavy, uneven, wrong. The anchor's voice trembled. "We have unconfirmed reports." Minutes passed that felt like hours. The camera returned to the newsroom. The man on screen removed his glasses. He looked down. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet. At approximately 1:00 p.m. Central Standard Time, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead. The sentence did not land. It shattered. Dean staggered backward as if someone had struck him. His hand found the back of the chair. His other hand went to his face. No sound came from his mouth, but something raw and broken moved there, something that wasn't language. Dead was a word meant for strangers, for history books, for old men, for stories, not for Jack. Not for the man who had laughed beside him in crowded rooms, who had clapped along offbeat to his songs, who had leaned close once and said, with that unmistakable grin, "Dean, you make people forget the weight of things." Dean sank into the chair. The television continued. Footage replayed, the motorcade, the crowd, the moment the world tilted. Somewhere far away, a phone began to ring. He didn't hear it at first. It rang again. And again. And again. Finally, as if from underwater, Dean reached for it. "Hello," his voice didn't sound like his own. There was a pause, then a familiar breath on the line. Dean, Frank Sinatra's voice was stripped of its polish, of its humor, of its effortless charm. It sounded small. "Did you hear?" "Yes," Dean whispered. Silence followed, the kind that only comes when both people are staring at the same invisible wound. "He was only 46, Frank said. He had kids. God, Dean, he had kids." Dean closed his eyes. The images kept coming. Jack at fundraisers, Jack backstage, Jack leaning against a piano, teasing him about a lyric. Jack not as a president, not as a symbol, but as a man. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. When the call ended, the house felt larger, emptier, as if something essential had been removed from its walls. Dean did not sit back down. He stood there until evening began to erase the shapes in the room. And that was when the second call came. The phone rang once. Dean answered immediately this time. "Mr. Martin," the voice was unfamiliar, controlled, official. "This is Ralph Dungan from the White House." Dean's grip tightened. "I'm calling on behalf of Mrs. Kennedy." The name struck harder than the news had. Jackie, the image of her in the pink suit, the blood, the stunned stillness. "Yes," Dean said. "There will be a state funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. The whole world will be watching. Mrs. Kennedy has made a personal request." A pause, carefully measured. "She would like you to sing." The room seemed to tilt. Sing. The word felt wrong in the air, like laughter at the wrong moment. She specifically asked for you, Mr. Martin. The president was very fond of your music. Dean closed his eyes. For the service, she has requested the Battle Hymn of the Republic. For a moment, Dean thought he might be sick. The Battle Hymn, a song of marching and sacrifice, of judgment and glory, of endings that masquerade as beginnings. Mr. Martin, the voice pressed, we understand this is sudden, but this is a great honor, one that will be remembered for generations. Honors, history, the world, all of it felt distant, unreal. Dean swallowed. I need time. There was a faint hesitation on the line. The funeral is Monday. We are finalizing the program. 2 hours, Dean said. Give me 2 hours. When the call ended, Dean did not move. He did not turn the television back on. He did not call anyone. He did not pour a drink. He walked instead toward the hallway at the back of the house, toward a door few people entered, toward a room he almost never opened. Inside it were boxes, old scripts, faded photographs, notes written in ink that had begun to yellow. And tucked into one corner, a small stack of letters tied with a ribbon. He sat on the floor. His hand hovered before touching them. Because somewhere inside those pages lived a night he had never spoken about, a promise no one knew, a conversation that did not belong to history. A night when another young man had been present, quieter then, sharper around the edges, not yet the symbol he would become. Clint. The name drifted through Dean's mind like a half-remembered melody. Lake Tahoe. A backstage hallway, cigarette smoke, laughter echoing from the showroom, and a door that had closed behind 3 men instead of 1. Dean exhaled slowly. The phone was still sitting on the table in the other room. 2 hours were already passing. And somewhere, in a memory he had buried carefully for 3 years, waited the real reason this decision was never going to be simple. Not for his career. Not for the country. Not for his conscience. The memory did not return gently. It came the way certain storms do, without warning, without permission, pulling Dean backward through time with a force he could not resist. The walls of his Lowe's Angel's home seemed to soften and stretch, the present loosening its grip as another place, another night, another version of himself rose in its place. Lake Tahoe, 1960. The air there had been sharp and clean, scented with pine and cold water, the kind of air that filled the lungs too quickly and made a man feel younger than he was. The Cal Neva Lodge had been glowing against the dark like something alive, light spilling from its windows, music leaking into the night, laughter drifting across the parking lot in loose, careless waves. Inside, the Rat Pack had been doing what the Rat Pack did best, turning a room into electricity. Frank's voice had cut through smoke and clinking glasses. Sammy's humor had cracked like fireworks. Dean's own songs had wrapped around the audience like silk. And at the center of it all, in the front row, sat a young senator from Massachusetts, handsome, confident, surrounded by donors and aides and admirers, clapping with an easy smile that hid the weight already beginning to settle on his shoulders. The show had been a triumph. 2 hours of applause, of polished jokes and perfectly timed notes, of that intoxicating sense that the world was open and generous and ready to be won. When Dean finally stepped forward, the spotlight warm on his face, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, your next President of the United States, John F. Kennedy." The room had risen as one, sound exploding upward, applause so loud it seemed to lift the ceiling. Kennedy had joined him on stage, laughing, embracing him, whispering something Dean could not hear. Jackie had smiled from her seat, poised and luminous, every inch already a first lady in waiting. It was history in rehearsal, optimism dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, and no one in that room could have imagined how violently the future would one day intrude. Backstage afterward, the noise had softened into corridors of muffled music and distant conversation. Dean had been loosening his tie in his dressing room, letting the heat leave his skin when there was a knock on the door. He had expected one of the guys, maybe a producer, maybe an assistant. Instead, when he opened it, John Kennedy stood there alone. No secret service, no handlers, no entourage. Just a tall young man in a dark suit, his smile present but thinner now, his eyes carrying something Dean had not seen from the stage. There was a brief, almost awkward pause, the kind that happens when 2 men realize the moment is not what either expected. Kennedy had gestured faintly. "May I come in, Dean?" Dean had stepped aside, and the door had closed behind them with a sound that, in memory, now felt louder than it had been at the time. For a few seconds, Kennedy had said nothing. He had simply stood there, hands resting against the back of a chair, head slightly bowed, as if listening to something only he could hear. Dean, attuned to moods after a lifetime of stages and studios, had felt it immediately. The energy was wrong. The confidence was still there, but it was strained, like a note held too long. "Senator," Dean had said lightly, "you look like the show didn't agree with you." Kennedy had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. He had finally pulled out the chair and sat, rubbing his palms together once slowly before looking up. "Dean," he had said, and the way he spoke the name had startled him. It wasn't the public voice. It wasn't the practiced voice. It was lower, quieter, stripped of polish. "I didn't come here to talk about the show." What followed had not been dramatic in the way movies make confessions dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no tears, no raised voices. There had been, instead, a long exhale, and then words that seemed to fall out of him rather than be chosen. He had spoken about pressure, about the faces he saw everywhere he went, about the way every handshake now felt like a test he did not know how to study for. He had spoken about his father's expectations, about history's expectations, about the terrible, invisible weight of being told again and again that the country was looking at you as if you were already something more than human. And then, finally, he had said the thing that had changed the room. "I'm afraid, Dean." Not of losing, not of the campaign, afraid of winning, afraid of waking up one day to discover that he was standing in a place meant for giants and that he was still inside only a man. Dean had listened without interrupting, his humor, his easy lines, his instinct to lighten moments all strangely absent. There had been something sacred in the way Kennedy spoke, something unguarded and rare. "They think I'm brave," Kennedy had said quietly. "They think I'm certain, but there are nights I can't sleep because I keep seeing the faces of people I haven't even met yet, people who will one day tell me I failed them. I keep wondering what happens if I become the worst president this country has ever known." He had laughed once, softly, without joy. "You sing for a living, Dean. You know what it's like to stand in front of people and have them expect something from you. Multiply that by 200 million. Dean had finally leaned forward. "Jack," he had said, and it was the first time he had used the name, "being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It means you understand what's at stake. The men who aren't afraid are the dangerous ones." Kennedy had watched him closely then, as if testing the words for truth. Dean had continued, slowly, deliberately. "You don't run for this because you're certain. You run because you care, and a man who cares enough to be afraid is a man people can trust." There had been a long silence after that, the kind that settles only when something real has been spoken. Kennedy's shoulders had lowered. He had nodded once almost to himself. "That's why I came," he had said. "I didn't come to hear praise. I came because I needed someone who wouldn't lie to me." It was then that the door had opened briefly, and another presence had paused at the threshold. Clint Eastwood, young, lean, not yet the icon he would become, had been passing by, called earlier to the lodge for a minor appearance, a handshake, a photograph, something forgettable in a life that had not yet begun to roar. He had stopped when he saw them, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. Kennedy had glanced up, recognized him vaguely, and motioned him inside. "Come in," he had said. "We're not discussing state secrets." Clint had stepped in, nodding politely to Dean, his expression attentive, almost wary, as if he sensed that something important was unfolding without quite knowing what it was. Kennedy had looked between them, and then, unexpectedly, he had smiled. "You know what I envy about you men?" he had said. "You make people feel something, not because you tell them to, but because you show them who you are." He had turned back to Dean. "If I win," he had said, the words careful now, "if this actually happens, I want you at the White House. I want music there, laughter. I don't want that building to become a tomb." Dean had grinned. "You win, Senator, and I'll sing there any time you ask." Kennedy's face had grown serious again. "No," he had said, "not any time, only when it's right, only when it's joyful. Promise me something." He had hesitated, searching for the shape of it. "Promise me you'll never sing for me when the room is filled with mourning. No funeral songs, no hymns for endings. If I'm going to do this, I want the music around me to remind me why." Dean had not understood, not fully, but he had seen the need in Kennedy's eyes, and something in him had responded before thought. "All right," he had said, "only happy songs." Kennedy had extended his hand, and Dean had taken it. Their grip had been firm, unremarkable, the kind of handshake that happened 1,000 times a day in places like that. But Clint, standing a few steps away, had noticed something else. He had noticed the stillness that had come over both men, the way the noise of the lodge seemed to recede, the way a casual moment had hardened into something solemn. Years later, he would not remember the exact words, but he would remember the feeling. that he had witnessed the birth of a promise without being invited into its details. When the night had ended, when the laughter had resumed and the future had once again felt bright and obedient, Dean had forgotten the weight of that handshake. He had not written it down. He had not spoken of it. It had slipped into the back of his life like a photograph placed carefully into a drawer, waiting without complaint. Now, 3 years later, sitting on the floor of his quiet house, the echo of applause long gone, Dean felt the full weight of it return. The White House wanted a hymn. The world wanted a symbol. History wanted a performance. But somewhere in the past, a young man had asked him for something smaller and harder, not a song, but a way of remembering. And Clint Eastwood, wherever he was at that moment, carried a fragment of that night too, a fragment that would soon pull him back into a story no one else could yet see forming. Dean closed his eyes. The phone call from Washington waited like a verdict, and the promise, old and invisible, waited with it. The 2 hours did not move like normal time. They stretched and tightened, contracting and expanding the way memory does when it collides with consequence. Dean could hear the clock in the hallway, each second a soft, mechanical reminder that the world outside his house was already preparing a ceremony in which he had not yet chosen whether he would exist. Somewhere, schedules were being drafted, hymns selected, seats assigned, words prepared that would travel across oceans and through millions of living rooms. And in the center of that immense machinery was a single unanswered question that only he could resolve. He stood from the floor slowly, as if rising too fast might disturb something fragile in the air, and walked back into the living room. The television was still on, silent images of Dallas repeating like a wound that refused to close. He did not sit. He remained standing, hands resting on the back of the chair, watching a country learn how to grieve. It was then that the knock came at the door. Dean did not expect anyone. He had told no one where he was. He moved toward the sound with a strange, distant calm, opened the door, and found Clint Eastwood standing on the step. Clint looked different than he had 3 years earlier, broader through the shoulders, lines just beginning to settle into his face, the quiet intensity that would one day be legendary already present in his eyes. He had not called ahead. He had not announced himself. He stood there as if he had been drawn by something rather than invited. "I heard you were home," Clint said. "I didn't know if this was the right thing to do." Dean stepped aside without a word, and Clint entered, his gaze drifting instinctively toward the television, toward the images neither of them needed to see again. They did not speak immediately. They stood in the same room where the White House call had landed, where a decision hovered like smoke. Clint was the one who finally broke the silence. "They've been trying to reach everyone," he said quietly. "Studios, singers, actors, anyone who ever stood near him. There's a kind of panic out there." Dean nodded once. "They called me too," Clint added. "Not to perform, just to be there, to be part of it." He hesitated. "They called you, didn't they?" Dean did not answer right away. He moved to the table, picked up the coffee cup he had abandoned hours earlier, and realized it had gone cold. He set it down again untouched. "They want me to sing," he said. The words sounded unreal even as he spoke them. Clint exhaled slowly. "That figures," he said. "If there's a voice people associate with something lighter than this, it's yours." Dean finally turned to look at him. "Do you remember Tahoe?" he asked. Clint's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a surface changes when something moves beneath it. "I remember," he said. "I didn't understand much of it at the time, but I remember the room, the way it felt." He paused. "And I remember the handshake." Dean closed his eyes briefly. "So you did see," he murmured. Clint nodded. "I didn't hear what was said," he replied, "but I knew it mattered." He took a few steps into the room, lowering himself into a chair, resting his forearms on his knees. "That night stayed with me," he continued. "Not because it was famous, because it was small and heavy." Dean sat opposite him, the space between them filled with 3 years of unspoken recognition. "He asked me for something," Dean said. "Not a performance, not loyalty. He asked me for a promise." Clint did not interrupt. "He told me he was afraid," Dean went on. "Not of losing, of becoming something he couldn't carry. He wanted music around him that reminded him he was alive, not history, not monuments, life." Dean's voice roughened. "He asked me never to sing for him when the room was filled with mourning." Clint leaned back slightly, absorbing it. "And now," he said quietly, "the whole country is one mourning room." The words settled between them, heavy and exact. The phone rang again. Dean did not answer it. He let it ring, the sound cutting across the quiet like a blade. Clint watched him. "They won't stop," Clint said. "Not until you give them something." Dean nodded. "I know." He looked toward the hallway, toward the boxes and letters, toward the past he had opened and could not now close. "They want a hymn," he said. "They want something that fits." Clint studied him. "And what do you want?" he asked. The question was simple. The answer was not. Dean stood and walked to the window, looking out at a sky that had begun to dim, the afternoon surrendering to a pale, uncertain evening. "I want to keep my word," he said. "I want to remember him the way he asked to be remembered, not as a body, not as a symbol, as a man who was still hoping." Clint was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried no persuasion, only acknowledgement. "Then you already know what this costs," he said. Dean closed his eyes. "Yes. They'll call it disrespect," Clint said. "They'll call it ego, they'll call it cruelty." Dean nodded once. "I know. They'll never hear the conversation," Clint continued. "They'll never see the handshake. I know. And you'll never be able to explain it without breaking what he gave you." Dean turned from the window. "That's the part you saw," he said softly. "The part that can't be explained." The phone fell silent at last. Almost immediately it rang again. Dean crossed the room, lifted the receiver, and spoke before the voice on the other end could fully introduce itself. "This is Dean Martin." There was a pause, then the measured tone of Ralph Dungan returned, thinner now, edged with urgency. "Mr. Martin, we're finalizing the program. Mrs. Kennedy has been asking. We need your answer." Dean looked at Clint, who did not nod, did not gesture, did not intrude. He only met Dean's eyes, present as a witness, not a guide. Dean turned slightly away, his free hand resting on the table, grounding him. "I've thought about it," he said, "and my answer is no." The word was soft. It was also immovable. There was silence on the line, the kind that hums with restrained reaction. "I'm sorry," Dungan said. "I can't sing at the funeral," Dean repeated, the voice sharpened. "Mr. Martin, do you understand what you're saying? Mrs. Kennedy personally requested you. The president loved your music, the nation." "I understand," Dean said. "Better than you think." Another pause, longer now. "May I ask why?" Dungan pressed. Dean felt the old instinct rise, the instinct to charm, to smooth, to give people something they could accept. He let it pass. "Personal reasons," he said. "That's not sufficient," the voice replied. "It's all I have," Dean answered. "This will be seen as a refusal of the president himself," Dungan said. "This will follow you." Dean's grip tightened on the receiver. "Some things follow you because they should," he replied. The man on the other end exhaled, controlled but unmistakably frustrated. "I will inform Mrs. Kennedy," he said, "and Mr. Martin, I hope you are prepared for what comes next." "I am," Dean said. He ended the call before the conversation could fracture further. The room felt different after that, as if a decision once spoken altered the temperature of the air. Clint rose slowly from the chair. "It's done," he said. Dean nodded. "It's done." Neither smiled, neither spoke for a moment. Outside, a car passed, its sound ordinary, indifferent. "They'll ask you," Clint said finally. "Reporters, friends, everyone, they'll want a story." Dean turned his head slightly. "And I won't give them one," he said, "because the real one isn't mine to tell." Clint regarded him with something like respect, something like sorrow. "Then I suppose," he said, "the rest of us will carry what little we can." Dean met his gaze. "You already are." Clint moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said without turning fully back, "I don't think he asked you for silence because he feared death. I think he asked because he feared being turned into something that wasn't him." Dean felt the words settle into him, heavy and strangely consoling. Clint opened the door. The evening light framed him briefly, then he was gone. Dean remained where he was, alone again, the echo of a promise filling the space where a performance might have been. Somewhere across the country, arrangements were shifting. Names were being crossed out. Another singer would be called. Another voice would rise over Arlington. But the one thing the world would never hear was the sound of a man keeping his word. November 25th, 1963, arrived without drama, without mercy, without pause. Morning broke over Arlington National Cemetery beneath a sky so pale it seemed to have been drained of color by the weight of what it was about to witness. The air was cold, the kind that carried sound far and made every footstep, every rustle of fabric, every distant command feel sharper than it should have. Leaders from across the world stood in dark coats, their faces rigid with ceremony, their eyes heavy with the understanding that this moment belonged not to any one nation, but to history itself. Soldiers moved with precision, their boots cutting clean lines into the ground, the flag-draped casket resting with a gravity that no wood or metal could truly hold. Somewhere among the gathered figures was Clint Eastwood, standing not as a star, not as a name, but as a man who had once stood in a small backstage room and watched a promise take shape between two others. He watched now as Jackie Kennedy stepped forward in black, her veil hiding nothing of the stillness in her face, her children beside her, small against the immensity of the world that had just changed around them. The music began. It was the battle hymn of the Republic. The voice that carried it was strong, trained, respectful. It rose into the cold air and drifted across the gathered mourners, across the rows of soldiers, across the cameras that would send it into homes across the globe. It was everything a nation expected a funeral song to be. It honored sacrifice. It framed loss in the language of endurance. It gave people something to hold while they tried to understand what could not be understood. But it was not Dean Martin's voice. Clint noticed the absence more than the sound. He felt it like a hollow place where something familiar should have been. He imagined briefly what it would have meant for that warmer, lighter tone to rise here to wrap itself around this moment. He imagined the comfort some might have taken from it. And then he imagined the other thing, the memory of a young man in Tahoe, hands shaking, asking not for a hymn, not for grandeur, but for happiness, for life, for music that reminded him he was still human. Clint lowered his gaze. The song ended. The ceremony continued. History moved forward, solemn and unstoppable. Thousands of miles away, Dean Martin sat alone in his living room, the curtains half drawn, the television filling the space with black and white images of a nation in formal mourning. He watched as the casket was carried. He watched Jackie's careful steps. He watched the folded flag. The house was silent except for the broadcast and the faint ticking of the clock that had measured the hours of his decision. He did not sing along. He did not speak. He did not look away. When the hymn played, he closed his eyes, not in protest, not in regret, but in something closer to private remembrance. He did not see a procession. He saw a young man backstage trying to laugh away fear. He saw a handshake. He heard words that no microphone had ever caught. By evening, the phones began to ring again. This time they did not carry official voices. They carried accusation, confusion, anger. Reporters left messages. Friends asked questions. Strangers wrote letters. Some were bewildered. Many were cruel. Why would a man refuse such an honor? Why would he deny a widow a request? Why would he turn his back on a nation in mourning? The stories multiplied quickly, as stories always do when truth refuses to appear. Dean Martin was ungrateful. Dean Martin was arrogant. Dean Martin was chasing attention. Dean Martin had disrespected a fallen president. The headlines sharpened. The tone hardened. The kindness that had so often been associated with his public image was replaced in ink and rumor with something colder. He read none of it. He let the mail pile up. He stopped answering the phone. The world, deprived of an explanation, filled the space with judgment. Clint Eastwood watched this unfold from a distance, reading the same papers, hearing the same voices. He understood more than most how quickly a narrative could form when silence was left alone to defend itself. He thought of calling Dean. He thought of offering to speak. And each time he stopped himself, because the truth he carried was not his to trade. He had seen the edge of it, felt its weight, but he had not been the one entrusted with it. To speak would be to simplify something that had never been simple, to expose a private human moment to a public that would only bend it into something easier to consume. So Clint did what few are willing to do. He let the misunderstanding stand. He let a man's reputation absorb a blow it did not deserve. He chose, in his own way, to honor the same promise, even without having made it. Weeks passed, then months. The story did not fade quickly. It lingered in interviews, in questions tossed out at press conferences, in moments when Dean was asked to explain himself and gave only the same answer calmly, without bitterness. Personal reasons. He never raised his voice. He never defended himself. He never tried to reshape the narrative. Those who wanted anger found it in his silence. Those who wanted scandal invented it. But those who watched closely sometimes noticed something else. They noticed that he did not speak of that week at all. He did not turn it into material. He did not fold it into his public persona. He carried it as something that did not belong to performance. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. It was simple, white envelope, official seal, handwritten address. Dean stood at the table for a long time before opening it, his fingers resting on the paper as if feeling for something beneath it. When he finally broke the seal and unfolded the pages, he recognized the handwriting immediately. Jackie Kennedy's words were measured, careful, but not distant. She wrote of grief, of exhaustion, of the strange stillness that follows the departure of a presence that once filled every room. She wrote that she had been told he had refused to sing, that many had spoken to her of anger and disappointment, that she herself had searched for a reason she could hold. And then she wrote of something smaller. She wrote of evenings when Jack had played records, of the way his mood changed when certain songs came on, of how he would tap the table, hum along, sometimes even pull her up from her chair and spin her clumsily across the floor. She wrote that he did not love sadness in music, that he did not find comfort in it, that he used music to remember the future, not to rehearse the past. She wrote that she could not know Dean's reasons, but that if they had anything to do with remembering Jack as he was when he was most alive, then she was grateful. She ended the letter simply, with respect. Dean sat down when he finished reading, not slowly, not carefully. He sat because his legs no longer seemed able to hold him. The room blurred. For the first time since Dallas, he wept without restraint, not because the world had misunderstood him, not because the story might never be corrected, but because the one person who mattered had understood without being told. She had found the shape of the truth without being given its words. And in that understanding, the promise had found its final witness. Years later, after Dean was gone, when belongings were sorted and rooms were emptied, that letter was found framed among his most private things. Beside it in his own hand were only a few lines. They did not explain. They did not accuse. They did not justify. They read simply, 1960, I gave my word. 1963, I kept it. Some promises are not meant for history. They are meant for the man you made them to. Clint Eastwood saw the letter after it was discovered. He stood for a long time before it, reading not only the words but the spaces between them. He thought of the way the world celebrates visible courage and so often misses the quieter kind. He thought of how easy it would have been for a man like Dean Martin to step into that ceremony, to sing, to be applauded for honoring the dead. And he thought of how much harder it had been to disappoint millions in order to remain faithful to one frightened man who had once trusted him with his fear. The world eventually moved on, as the world always does. New stories took the place of old ones. New questions replaced the unanswered. But beneath all of it, beneath the performances and headlines and remembered images, remained something that could not be televised or archived. The truth that on a day when history demanded a voice, one man chose silence, not out of indifference, not out of pride, but out of loyalty. And in that silence, he sang the only song that promise ever asks of us.